Hello, I'm Marvat Eljurdi, Senior Coordinator and a Special Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa with the Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives at the University of Central Florida. Allow me to start by thanking you all for joining us today for this timely and pertinent discussion. It is riveting to hear different perspectives from two regions of the world on migration management and learn from each other's experiences. We are very excited about this collaboration between UCF and AEC, and more specifically between our office, Global Perspectives and International Initiatives, and UCF and AEC Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. This endeavor is made possible by the generous contribution of the Nancy and Jonathan Wolf Global Academic Initiative. To get this conversation started, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Carla Sabanza, an affiliate researcher at AEC Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. Dr. Abanza holds degrees in education, literature, sociocultural analysis, and sociology and anthropology. He's an academic with over 20 years of teaching experience in several institutions in the Americas, Europe, and more recently in the North of Africa, and over 10 years of research experience in the fields of international migration and development, human trafficking, return and reintegration, and migration governance. Dr. Abanza is also an international consultant who worked with several key organizations and an avid researcher with publications in global magazines. Without further ado, welcome, Dr. Abanza. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mifat. And I also applaud this event as the two universities come together to, as you said, address a very timely topic having to do with migration and refugees now with the Ukraine crisis. Thank you all very much for joining us in this special event where we have 4 experts who will explore migrant and refugee issues in Florida and Cairo. 2 of them are from UCF and the other 2 are from AUC. My role as a moderator is to guide the conversation so that we explore several key issues concerning migrant and refugee communities in Florida and Cairo and their impact on local communities. For this, we will follow the classical approach of dividing our time into 2 parts. For part 1, we will have 4 rounds of exchanges. Each round should take approximately 10 minutes, followed by part 2, which will be a Q&A session, which will take the remaining of our time, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, depending on how we do in the first part. For round 1, we will address the following topics: migrant and refugee flows and stocks in Florida and Cairo, reception and sponsorship of migrant and refugee communities, migrant and refugees' impact on local communities, and lessons learned, best ways forward, and long-term strategies. So basically the idea is that by providing our expertise, we will be able to see how these 2 locations can learn from each other, and as we propose different ways forward. Please, for the Q&A questions, I will ask you to write your questions in the chat, and I will try to address as many of those as possible. In the interest of time, I will now briefly present each one of the experts, highlighting some of the key features. But of course, I will have to leave many of other key features out due to their extensive knowledge and list of publications. Fernando Rivera is a professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at UCF. He has previously served as an interim assistant vice provost for faculty excellence, UCF Global Faculty Fellow, and provost faculty fellow. Dr. Rivera has also served in different task forces related to accelerating Latino student success and Hispanic serving institutions. His research interests and activities are in medical sociology, disasters, race, and ethnicity, to name a few. For his work focuses on physical and mental health outcomes with a particular emphasis on Latino populations and factors associated with disaster resilience, restoration and resilience, and climate migration. He has written extensively on disaster resilience and disaster vulnerability. He earned his MA and PhD in sociology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and his BA in sociology from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. He also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute for Health, Healthcare Policy, and Aging Research at Rutgers University. Maritza Concha holds a PhD in public affairs with a concentration in public administration from the University of Central Florida, a master's degree in Latin American Studies at University of Miami, and a bachelor's degree in international relations at Florida International University. For the past 15 years, Dr. Concha has been working as an evaluator for local nonprofits serving Latino immigrants. Her other areas of research are service partnerships and evaluating projects that serve at-risk populations such as victims of trafficking, refugees, and low-income minorities. Dr. Concha has published her research and evaluation studies in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Migrant and Minority Health, Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences, Journal of Community Practice, and International Journal of Public Administration. She is a member of the Advancing Collaborative Evaluation Network funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and she is an active member of the American Evaluation Association. On the other side of the Atlantic, Maisa Ayub is an associate director for the Center of Migration and Refugee Studies. She has a PhD in Euro-Mediterranean Studies from the Faculty of Political Science at Cairo University. She holds an MA in sociology and a graduate diploma in migration and refugee studies from the American University in Cairo, and a BA in economics from Cairo University. She has been teaching at AUC since 2017. Dr. Ayub is a member of the Middle East Studies Association and the International Association for Study of Forced Migration. She is among the founding committee members of the MENA Civil Society Network for Displacement, developed by UNHCR. She is regularly invited to present and lecture in various venues, including the Research Center on Transnational Crime of Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan, the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C., and the Netherlands Flemish Institute in Cairo, just to name a few. Last but not least, Elena Habersky is a project manager at the Egyptian Migration Hub and the former project manager of the Refugee Entitlements in Egypt project, both undertaken by the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at AUC. She has almost a decade of experience working with displaced populations in both Jordan and Egypt, and has conducted ethnographic research in Amman, Cairo, Kampala with Darfuri and Congolese refugees. She has published on various migration topics for the WHO, Egyptian Streets, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs. As I was saying, now that I have presented our four distinguished panelists, I will now transition to the first round of questions and exchanges between Florida and Cairo. I was saying, as a country, Egypt essentially is a migrant sending nation, although Egypt is also a country that receives migration and also holds people in transit. while the US is almost an exclusively migrant receiving country. In these cases, and also in terms of population, Egypt holding about 100 million people and the US holding 330,000 million people, you would think that there are no points of comparison between these two countries. The idea is that we will not be discussing countries per se, but rather our experiences specifically in Florida and Cairo, in which case is very interesting because both Florida and Cairo host a population of 22 million people each. And for a long period of time, both Florida and Cairo have been hosting migrants and refugees, and they continue receiving people as we speak. So in this context, our main objective is to explore how these two settings have evolved in terms of their practices of reception and sponsorship, and also how public policies have developed over time to help manage these flows of migrants and refugees. So for the first round, I would like to ask Fernando and Maisa to please give us an idea of the historical waves and current trends of migrant and refugee communities arriving in Florida and Cairo.
Maisa, I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure. Okay, so thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you, everyone. Yes, as you said, Egypt is ascending country, is portrayed in the literature as ascending country, but Egypt has also been receiving a large number of people who are forced to leave because of war, of persecution. And this is not recent. This is historically, since 1920, it hosted Armenians. After 1948, it hosted Palestinians. However, the largest influx of forced migrants to Egypt occurred with the wars in the Horn of Africa in 1990. When Egypt started to receive considerable number from Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and then came the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where a large number of Iraqis came to Egypt. And as of 2011, in addition to these nationalities, Egypt is receiving forced migrants from Syria, Yemen, as well as south of Sudan. Now, the approach to asylum is that refugees and forced migrants, when they arrive to Egypt, they have to register with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and they are registered as asylum seekers. Once their case is assessed and their eligibility for asylum is confirmed, they are transformed from the category of asylum seekers to the category of refugees. When we talk about numbers, the official numbers are the numbers of those registered at UNHCR. And as of the statistic of December 2021, the total number of people of concern who are the asylum seeker and refugees is 271,000 registered at UNHCR. This, of course, is not the real number, because we know that there are many, much more bigger number of asylum seekers and refugees who are living in Egypt and not registered with UNHCR. And the reason why there is a discrepancy between the official and unofficial number is basically two reasons. Many do not register with UNHCR, and the reason why they don't register is also multiple. Could be mostly because out of fear. So those people are fleeing conflict and wars, and many of them, they don't like to be documented, so they don't get registered, or they are unaware of the process of seeking asylum in Egypt, so they don't register, or there is a concern or a stigma around the term refugees, so they don't register for that reason. The second reason is that many of those who are declined, their asylum claim is declined, they don't leave Egypt, but they tend to stay in Egypt. And that's why the number is really much larger, but unfortunately, we don't know the exact number. And if it's difficult to assess or to know the real number of asylum seekers and refugees in Egypt, it's even more difficult to know the number of migrants. Because in an attempt to protect its labor market, the Egyptian labor law stipulate that foreign workers cannot be more than 10% of any business establishment. And in order to fall within this 10%, they have to demonstrate that they have skills that are not matched in the local market, and they have to acquire a work permit before coming to Egypt. So for this reason, the number of formal migrant worker is really very low. And however, we know that there are a lot of irregular migrant workers in Egypt, for example, from West Africa, specifically Nigerian. For example, we know that there are many Nigerian working in Egypt, but we don't know the numbers. The distinction between forced migrant and labor migrant is really difficult because people flee for many reasons. So people come to Egypt or flee their countries from Africa to Egypt for many reasons, including economic reasons, political reasons, wars, environment, and it could be a combination of many. And they are pulled to Egypt also for many reasons. One is they know that UNHCR is there, so they're seeking protection. Another is the hope or the belief that they will find economic opportunities in Egypt in the huge informal sector. And the third reason is the proximity of Egypt to Europe. So there is this hope that they might, from Egypt, move forward to Europe. So that's why the numbers are difficult to know, and the reasons are really combination of reasons. Despite the fact that it's difficult to know who is a migrant and who is a refugee, the policies of the Egyptian government towards both categories is different. So when it comes to forced migrant, there is somehow a policy. And it is as early as 1954 when the Egyptian government signed a memorandum of understanding with the UNHCR, and by this memorandum of understanding, Egypt delegated its responsibility to UNHCR to assess, to register forced migrant and to assess their claim for asylum. Egypt is also signatory to the 1951 Geneva Convention. However, when it ratified the convention in 1981, it placed a number of reservations on a number of articles of the convention that restricted the rights of refugees in Egypt. However, over the years, there has been some expansion in these rights in terms of ministerial decrees and presidential decrees that gave certain additional rights to refugees. So, for example, asylum seekers and refugees have access to primary healthcare services. Certain groups of refugees, mainly Sudanese and Syrians, have access to primary education. However, the reservation on the 1951 convention were not lifted. At present, there is a discussion of the first asylum law in the history of Egypt. So at present, this law is being drafted. We don't know the provision of the law yet. We don't know if it will restrict or expand the right of refugees. We really hope it will expand, but at present, we don't know what will happen. This is with regard to forced migrant. With regard to labor migrant, as I mentioned, because of the fact that the high level of unemployment, the fact that Egypt is a developing country, there is a lot of protection to the labor market. And as I said, only those who can get a work permit before coming to Egypt are allowed to work in Egypt. And that's why the number of migrant worker is very low. the official number, but we know that there is a lot of irregular migrants who are working in Egypt irregularly and staying in Egypt irregularly. And these are, of course, the most vulnerable group because they don't have any any kind of protection. I think that's very briefly.
Thank you. Yes, it's very comprehensive. Your answer is truly comprehensive. Thank you very much. Let's see how it compares to what is going on in Florida. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. And, we're already starting seeing some of the similarities in terms of that. But before I begin, in terms of the terminology, right, that might be a little bit different in the context of the different countries, right? So in the context of Florida, right, and in terms of what is an asylum seeker, right? So it's a person in or entering the US who is unable or unwilling to return to their nation of origin due to credible fear of persecution on the basis of religion, nationality, social, or political group membership. Some of the asylum seekers are also refugees, like Maisa said, as well. When we talk about immigrant, it's a person that leaves their nation of origin to settle into a new country, which we also have a definition of migrant, which is a person moving within or across borders, usually for economic reasons, work, like farm workers, seasonal workers, and those in temporarily farm work who do not move from permanent residence. And we have refugees. We are people entering the US who is unable or unwilling to return to their nation of origin to the ongoing war, violence, or persecution. So one of the things we were asking, kind of like the ebbs and flows, right? What were some of the margins out here? And I was looking in Florida, and one of the ways in terms of the measurement, right, which is always a challenge to have an accurate account out here. One of the ways that they do it here is to using some of the census data that we have is how many people are foreign born. And from that number, you can sort of tell, what are the top groups out here? And it tells you, that people have settled from other places, right? So if you look back in the 70s, and in Florida, the constant has been the Cuban population, right? And we know that, this has been a response to, the Cuban Revolution back in the 1960s, but it continues to be the dominant migrant group here or immigrant group in the United States. And obviously, Florida has not necessarily has borders with other states, but in terms of other nations, it's probably air and sea, right? In terms of that, and as a nation, right, the majority of migrations are overstay visas, right? Because we have to distinguish between between documented and undocumented migration as well in terms of that. But if you look at that, obviously, in looking at the years, you see some of the ebbs and flows of the things that were happening throughout the world. And like you were saying, Carlos, we receive a lot of people when there's things going on in the world. The U.S. tends to receive those people. And Florida continues to be a growing state, right? Which might add to the discussion later on in terms of, what can you do when, it's not only immigration, but it's also population movement within the United States. And, that gets into the resources, that get into the issue of climate, that gets into the issue of sustainability. But looking at that, even, looking at, eventually, in the 1980s, we had in the top 5, we have Germany, because the issues that were going on in Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. When we started seeing in the 1990s, according to these definitions out here, Puerto Rico comes as a significant number of people moving away from the island of Puerto Rico, and also Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Is sort of believed not to be is not part of the United States, and they get counted differently. But you see kind of like the influence of this population going on out here. And if you look, if you start looking at the 2000, you see sort of the impact of the people from Latin America. So now we're starting seeing Central Americans, we have started seeing South Americans as well. And if you follow sort of world events, with the different, revolutionary movements and different wars that were going on in Central and South America. It gives you kind of like the reflection that along the way that happens out here in terms of that and how people are responding. And if you look at the top 5 countries right now, the latest stats out here is Cuba, Haiti, Colombia, Mexico, and Jamaica. So if you look in terms of this, it's mostly an immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean. Obviously, because the context of reception, we're going to talk a little bit later about that. But when we talk about refugees, right, and kind of like contextualizing the issue out here in terms of that, in terms of the political scene. So this is kind of like the state of Florida. The people that are sort of officially viewed as refugees that you get services to, right? And just to give you some of the numbers, the top ones were, again, Cuba and Haiti. So in 2016, this is sort of the fiscal year that they had, we had about 62,000 refugees from different countries, right? And they go all the way from Syria, Iraq, Burma, Afghanistan, and other places throughout the world. But 62,000 in a state of almost 23 million people. If you look at what happened in 2017, that number reduces to 33,279, right? And obviously, when you look again in 2020, you look at the number really, it could have been for the COVID situation, but only 5,000 in 2019, 5,000 refugees, and it jumped this year, 2021, to 30,000. So one of the issues with the ebbs and flows out here is sort of the policies that are put in place, right? And so unfortunately, although nationally, we sell the idea that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, immigration comes with some denotation of, not necessarily kind of like us versus them out here. So the local politics do actually play a sense into how are we going to receive. And we see kind of like the same things that Maisa was saying in terms of, a lot of people go behind, not necessarily are counted or want to be counted because of the things that might happen out there. And we had, in terms of measurement, we had a strong battle in the United States. Every 10 years, by decree of the Constitution, we count everybody that is in the United States. And there was a lot of contention in the 2020 census of who's the people that we're going to count, right? So there was a strong push to make sure that we only counted citizens, right? People that had permanent residence or were US citizens out here or were documented out here. And obviously that brings about, sort of the debate in terms of the measurement, all sort of things, that, there was a push not to count another segment of the population that is important, especially in Florida, right? And we're going to talk, a little bit later in the other rounds about the impact and some of the things that happen out here in terms of that. But you see, there's a lot of issues that are very similar in terms of the reception and what they bring. Sometimes, depending on the context of where the movement happened, right? So I can speak to what happened after Hurricane Maria, where a lot of Puerto Ricans decided to come here, a lot of them short-term, but there was kind of like this favorable context of reception. Since they're US citizens, there were no issues with, visas and all sort of stuff, and contrast that with another hurricane that happened with the Bahamas, that basically, you have the issues of, people were put in boats to come to here and they were turned back because they didn't have the legal status required, all those type of things, right? So a lot of the context out here, and not to say I was, one of the exercise out here, I was looking back kind of like in the 90s, Puerto Ricans were not viewed favorably in town as well, right? They were saying, you're bringing drugs to our community, all those type of things. And it was sort of the population that we had here that had to fight the stereotypes out here in terms of where as well. But in terms of context, in terms of it, we could say that Florida draws a lot of people throughout the world, but a majority of it is from Latin America and the Caribbean. And with that, I'm keeping time out here to make sure that we flow out here. So I look forward to the questions and to the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much. Also very comprehensive. And it starts, with the two answers, we start having an idea of what is the picture, what is the profile of migrants and refugees that have been going to both Florida and Cairo for a number of years, decades actually, and the most current trends. Thank you very much. Now, as we transition towards round two, in which we want to explore reception and sponsorship of migrant and refugee communities, I would like to ask Elena and Maritza to please let us know how is the government managing these flows, where, as we see, it's in the thousands. Some of them have been accounted for, but many of them, or the majority of them, are irregular or have not been accounted for, or were failed asylum seekers and are now part of the population, but in this kind of limbo, both legally and otherwise. So how is the government managing these flows? And in practice, are these populations able to access the domestic labor market? Do they have access to essential services? So if you could please shed some light with these issues. Thank you.
I'll go first. Can I share my screen? Because I did prepare a brief PowerPoint. Right, so
yes, we can see it.
You can see it, perfect. So I'm just going to minimize myself. I'm just going to go over a couple of findings. This is a study I did with the Department of Children and Families for the state of Florida regarding self-sufficiency and acculturation of refugees in Central Florida. So I'll give you a little bit of background, and then I'll talk more about how the government handled the immigration, specifically the local government of Central Florida, and the services that the refugees receive, including the economic, labor market, and other acculturation processes. So the Florida Department of Children and Families is the state refugee coordinator for the refugee services in Florida. And it's a state program that coordinates and oversees the services provided to refugees and asylees entrants into Florida. So the idea for this program is to account for the type of services that refugees receive in several counties in Central Florida, to promote or to demonstrate how well self-sufficiency and acculturated the refugees were. So this was a 5-year contract that I got prior joining to UCF to evaluate refugee self-sufficiency and acculturation. And it included refugees residing from Orange County, Osceola County, and Seminole counties. And this program ran from 2013 to 2017. So the data that I'm going to show you, it's only on 2017. But what we did is that we used survey research design. The sampling was purposive, in which we got a list of refugees from the Florida Department of Children and Families for refugees that resided in Osceola, Orange, or Seminole, who were 18 years of age. And we were able to gather surveys from 798 refugees from a list or a population of 2,568 individuals. So we got about 30% approximately. We did a survey via telephone. It was a 10 to 15 minute survey, and we used interpreters. We have used these interpreters over 17 languages, if I remember correctly. But most of them were from Haiti and from Cuba, as what Fernando was saying, and I'll show that in a minute. And we also did analysis, very descriptive cluster relations and non-parametric tests. So show you the results. Like I said before, we collected 798 surveys from refugees in Central Florida, all over the world. As you can see, the most of them, 63% were from Cuba, 15% were from Haiti, and then we have about 9% from Southeast Asia, 5% from Latin America, 2.4% from East Asia, 4.6% from Africa, and less than 1% from Europe. The majority of the participants in this survey were males, and 1/3 of females, and the average age was 40 years of age. So this is the status, the employment status, and you see that throughout the 4 years of where the survey was collected. So we see a little bit of an increase, a slightly increase between employment. And like I said before, just something to clarify, this goes from 2013 to 2017. So these are numbers prior COVID as well. I'm sure that the numbers have changed drastically if we collect this data during the pandemic. But anyway, we see a couple of, I guess, slightly improvement in terms of employment, range from 64% back in year 1 to 74% in year 2. We also see people who were not seeking for employment drop from year 3 from almost 20% to 12.20% in year 4 in 2017. And the unemployment rate was slightly increased as well in year 4, but if you take a look in year 1, that was almost 30%. So the trend is that the unemployment rate was going down, meaning that there is more opportunity for employment during that time frame. For males, more males tend to be more employed than females, and for females, the most reported reasons why they are not looking for a job is because they don't have a work permit, they have poor health, retirement age, the level of English proficiency, and childcare. When it comes to monthly income rankings, the refugees who are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean has the highest monthly income, which is about $3,373 a month, followed by Cuba refugees, and then the least ones are the ones from Haiti and Africa. Also, less than 40% of refugees indicated not to use public assistance, even though the service was out there for them to reach out. There is some sort of lack of coordination or lack of communication in terms of seeking the services. And about 1/3 of participants indicated that the financial situation is worse than expected. Specifically for refugees from Haiti, Africa, and East Asia. And that makes sense because those refugees are the ones that make less money, less income on a monthly basis, if you can see that as well. Something that I want to highlight is that Haiti reported the highest unemployment, the highest financial needs, and also the income is not enough to cover basic needs and other expenses, as well as on how to pay mortgages. And financial need is associated with obviously the work status, receiving medical services, use of public assistance, level of English proficiency, the status of whether the spouse is working, the level of acculturation, education in the US, and also the satisfaction of being in the US in general. Another thing that we tracked was the English proficiency and education levels for participants. So you see the green bar is the English proficiency at the time of arrival, and the yellow one is the time of the English proficiency at the time of survey administration. So if you see at the end, we have about 57% of refugees saying that they did not speak English at all when they got to the US, and that number decreased significantly to 16%. So there is a tendency that the more time they have in the US, the more likely they're going to be learning English and becoming more English proficient. 60% of all refugees have at least high school diploma before coming to the US, and the highest percentage of refugees who completed a 4-year university are from Latin America, followed by Near East or Southeast Asia. Also, 85% of refugees indicated not to be enrolled or any type of education after coming to the US. And that could be related to the need of becoming more self-sufficient and trying to secure for a job rather than going back to school and earn a degree. And that could also be associated with the English proficiency as well. So English proficiency is associated with the time of the US, the age, the use of public assistance, level of acculturation, and also having American friends. All of that makes a lot of sense. If you have limited English proficiency, obviously, if the older you are, the more difficult it is. The lower your level of English, the most likely that you have problems with acculturator, you have problems with finding American friends, and also using the system, navigating the system, and using public assistance. So what support services do participants use, right, in refugees? 94% of refugees indicated to receive medical services. 3,624 is the number of times of participants have received services from Catholic Charities of Central Florida, which is an organization that provides support services for refugees. 90% indicated that life in the US is expected or better than expected, and that 80% have participants have applied to a residency card. So again, social integration, something that is very common sense. It is associated with English proficiency, with feeling glad in the US, and also becoming US citizen. So let me see if I get that for next round. So let me just stop sharing. And I'm sure
Thank you, Maritza. Thank you very much. Also very, very comprehensive. Thank you very much. Very interesting study, and it allows us to understand not only the demographics, but how they have been sponsored and settled in Florida, in the central part. Thank you very much. Please, Elena.
Yes, thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you, Maritza, for that very comprehensive overview in Florida. So I'm going to be speaking on the situation in Cairo, and I would just like to start off by reiterating a lot of what Maisa said, because it's very important to understanding the situation on the ground in Cairo. So Egypt in general, I would say, having experience within the Middle East and North Africa region, is unique in that it has actually signed both the 1951 convention and its protocol. Many of the countries in the region have not signed either of these conventions. For example, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey has only signed the 1951 convention and not its protocol, which took away the geographic limitations imposed by the convention. And these are the countries that are hosting the majority of Syrian refugees. So you can imagine the issues that arise from not signing the conventions. But Egypt has signed both the convention and its protocol, as well as the 1969 African Union Convention on the rights of refugees. So not to go into super legal terminology, but really the 1951 convention, the definition of who can become a refugee are those who are fleeing persecution from their countries of origin for a variety of reasons. For example, they're being persecuted because they belong to a particular social group, or because they belong to a particular religion, or they have a political opinion that goes against the state that they're fleeing from, and the state is either no longer or unwilling to protect them. So if they were to go back to their country of origin, they would face persecution. But the 1969 convention, I think, is very forward-thinking, even now, I would say, in that it really increased the definition of those fleeing generalized violence, so war and conflict. And others can argue that it may also cover those who are fleeing climate change and these issues that I feel are now very current, and we see them in the news more and more because these aren't covered by the 1951 convention. Now, it can be argued that is Egypt following the 1951 convention definition or the 1969 convention? And we found in our research at the center that they're more following the 1951 convention. But still, I would say the majority of people who are applying for asylum, as Maisa mentioned, they're coming from known areas, unfortunately, of persecution, but also protracted conflicts. So when you talk to refugees, and specifically in Cairo, their hopes were either to get resettled once they came to Cairo, but we know that the global resettlement number worldwide for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is less than 1% of all registered refugees. So the likelihood of these refugees being resettled to the so-called global north, either in Europe or North America, Australia, New Zealand, is very, very low. There's also, the possibility of going home, of being able to return to their countries of origin. But again, this is not very likely because a lot of these conflicts, unfortunately, are protracted. So if we're looking at issues in Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Darfur, South Sudan, these are unfortunately Syria, Yemen, of course, ongoing conflicts. So the likelihood of these refugees returning to their countries of origin is also very low. So then the third so-called durable solution from UNHCR, besides resettlement and returning voluntarily to your country of origin, I would just like to say that the state cannot force you back to your country of origin. You have to voluntarily return. But the third durable solution is social integration. So integration with the local community, so within the Egyptian society. So of course, this brings a whole host of issues. How do these people, how do these refugees who have this legal definition, this legal term, how do they access services that should be granted to them from the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol? Now, Egypt, again, unlike its neighbors or a lot of the neighboring countries, does not have a policy of encampment. So there are no camps in Egypt, right? Sometimes we see in Turkey and Jordan, in Lebanon, that refugees are housed in camps normally run by either UNHCR or perhaps a government donor, where they receive access to their services in these camp-like settings. But for Egypt, that's not the case. All refugees reside in urban areas. The majority obviously reside in Cairo. It's the capital, it's the urban center, it's where everything happens. But of course, some reside in Alexandria, a cosmopolitan city on the north coast, but also Port Said and Suez, so areas where there's a lot of trade, and even in Upper Egypt in the south, and Aswan and Luxor, in the hopes of working with tourism and working in hotels and hospitals and these kinds of places with the Egyptian population. So in order to access these services, Egypt is interesting in the fact that, as Mice also mentioned, they're working on an asylum law, but there's really no law on refugees in general. So when we're looking at how can refugees access these services, we're mainly looking at laws that apply to foreigners. So in general, this can apply to refugees, it can apply to labor migrants, it can apply to asylum seekers, it just applies to foreigners in general. Now, there are some decrees that are recent ministerial decrees that specifically target or mention refugee populations. So for example, again, as Dr. Maisa mentioned, there is an agreement between the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees and the Ministry of Health and Population that all registered refugees, so those registered with UNHCR, which unfortunately does not include asylum seekers, those waiting to hear their status determination, or failed asylum seekers, but refugees are able to access public, primary, and secondary health care on par with Egyptian nationals. This is a great law. In theory, it's amazing. And it's very rare, even in the region, to find a law where refugees can access healthcare services on par with nationals. However, if we're talking about actual implementation, well, then we get, it's a bit more complicated, let's say. The Egyptian public healthcare system, for all intents and purposes, is maybe not the greatest. If we're being completely honest, there's issues of a lack of resources. There's issues with overcrowding, especially in public hospitals. There's issues with not enough doctors, especially outside of Cairo, or those who are versed in a particular medical issue. So when we talk to different migrant communities or different refugees about their experiences with accessing the public healthcare system, they say, well, I needed a doctor to treat me for this. I went to this hospital, they weren't there. I had to go to another hospital, they weren't there. And by the end of the day, they had to go to 3 or 4 public healthcare hospitals to find a doctor who was trained in the issues that they were experiencing. Or unfortunately, and this has to be mentioned, racism and xenophobia is a huge issue in the healthcare system, especially with regard to more current political issues. So for those who are unaware, Egypt and Ethiopia are having a political issue over the wish of Ethiopia to build a dam, which would affect the flow of the Nile River, which is a huge source of life for most Egyptians. So most Egyptians, they're very cordial and they're welcoming. But unfortunately, some people take this to mean, well, you're Ethiopian, I'm not going to treat you because your government is, causing an issue with our government. So these are stories, unfortunately, that we have heard. Another entitlement that I really want to discuss is education. Egypt, as Maisa had mentioned also previously, has some reservations on the 1951 Convention. So again, not to get into much of a legal jargon, but Egypt practices progressive realization in this instance. So what they're saying is we as a developing country eventually would love to offer public education to everyone, but because of our status as a developing country, we are not able to do so at the current time. But there's no time limit for when this reservation can be lifted. So they're saying, yes, eventually we will hopefully offer education to all students, but right now this is not the case, and there's no time limit for when this can be lifted. So again, this is a huge issue. Now, there are ministerial decrees for Syrians, for Yemenis, for Sudanese, and for South Sudanese to access the public education system. However, many of the East African communities are left out of these ministerial decrees. Now, it's said because that their native language is not Arabic, so they would have difficulties in accessing the public education system. But we also found in our research that a lot of these children were born in Egypt. Their parents fled because of the protracted situations in their countries. You know, they're not able to return. They give birth here, and their children grow up here speaking Arabic and their native languages. So what happens is many of these communities then form their own schools, so they're community schools, but these schools are not recognized by the Ministry of Education. So their students are receiving an education, usually from their country of origin, using curriculum from their country of origin, but you know, they're not necessarily being recognized by the Ministry of Education, and therefore it's harder to go into university or into trade schools or other instances. So of course, you know, I would say the majority of refugees here are thankful in a sense that Egypt kind of has a hands-off approach, I would say, to managing migration, and that, as I said, a lot of their entitlements fall under what foreigners in general receive, and they don't have to stay in camps, and they don't have to, you know, deal with other things. But at the same time, they have to try and access their services, you know, either by themselves or by these smaller NGOs or international organizations, which obviously have limited services. So it is obviously a complex and complicated system here. The laws exist, the implementation is not always, unfortunately, on par with what the law in practice says. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Elena. Very comprehensive, and it actually, with both your intervention and Maritza's, we start seeing also how some of these communities have a real impact on their hosting societies, which is the exploration we're going to start now for round 3, how migrants and refugees impact local communities. In this regard, Fernando and Elena, I want to frame it in a way that we can actually speak about the positive and the negative impacts. As we know, oftentimes the public opinion only focuses on the negative impact of migrants and refugees in destination countries or cities. But there is nothing farther from the truth, right? We know that in real terms, there is also a lot of positive impact that is done in many different ways. So we wanted to explore, you know, some of the impact, hopefully in different dimensions: the political sphere, the economic sphere, the social sphere. So with this in mind, could you please talk to us about the political, economic, and social impacts, both positive and negative, of migrants and refugees in Florida and Cairo, please?
If you want me to start, you know, those are important in a place like Florida, right? We've seen, you know, the impact that this population movements have had, right? Without a doubt, the Cuban influence in the politics of the states is very important. And they have, you know, sort of incorporated those things, right? I always tell people that Miami is the largest Latin American city in the United States, right? It has completely changed the landscape of what's happening in the state, right? Some of the positive contributions out there. Puerto Ricans in Central Florida are sort of beginning to have that impact as well, in terms of, they're eligible to vote. Every political campaign, politicians are seeking their vote and all those type of things. But, and we can say, 1 in 4 workers in Florida is an immigrant. So the impact to the labor force is immense, right? We have about 2.7 million immigrants that constitute about 26% of the labor force in the state of Florida. And we talk about the different industries, right? And this is kind of like the overall recap in terms of that. But if you can look at some of the industries where you see agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, construction, transportation, warehousing, are some of the big industries out there. And obviously at a state that continues to grow, a state that has issues with affordable housing, those become sectors of the population that certain immigrant groups do actually hold out here. Those are the positive aspects of it. But to signal to Elena and some of the issues she brought, right? The issue of racism and discrimination is alive, right? And one of the things is that even within immigrant groups, there's some type of contempt, right? In terms of that, and people don't understand it. The legacy of race in the United States continues, right? There's kind of like ideal immigrants, ideal refugees, and there's not necessarily desirable type of migrants, right? It could be language, it could be religion, it could be region of the world that they come to. And that creates some problems, right? Especially when they don't seem that they're going to be protected by the institutions that we have, right? When we have campaigns that are saying like, the problem that we have is just immigrants taking your jobs, doing crime, all those type of things. And by far, that happens all the time, but it creates a very touchy situation for a lot of people, right? In terms of policy in the United States, we have DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That is a program that started with the Obama administration, and basically that it provides some temporary status and privileges to kids 16 and under that, their parents brought them here. So they don't have, so that brings about certain issues, but sometimes, a lot of people are at the mercy of the laws and the regulations and the political sort of leanings that we might have. It makes it really difficult out here to go the legal route because it takes so long. It takes so much resources in terms of, it's just backlog. The amount of immigration sort of papers and hearings that you need to have is unattainable for a lot of people. And when we're talking about issues of, hunger and issue of desperation, a lot of people don't have the time to go through that process or the resources to go through that process, but that creates animosity between the people that have gone through that process, right? And sort of that's sort of the criticism you hear a lot of the time, and sort of the backlash in some of the things out here. But without a doubt, the role of immigrants in the state of Florida has completely transformed the state into something different, right? Where in a lot of places we're becoming places where there's a majority of Latino and Hispanic populations out here that has changed sort of the makeup of the state. Obviously providing very positive contributions out here, but the problems do actually still remain. One of the things with migration law and immigration law, that's at the federal state. The local governments can do certain things, but more and more, it's a constant battle out here in terms of the perceptions that people have and the actual policies that are in place. So I'm going to leave it at that because I know we're running a little bit behind on time, but I look forward to the response of the other panelists.
Thank you. Please, Elena, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Fernando. So I think, to put it nicely, I think the political contribution of refugees is more, let's say, silent, right? Because political situation in Egypt is complicated and it's complex. So I'm just going to leave that there. But I think for, what has happened within the past few years Egypt has always had more of, as I mentioned, a hands-off approach to migration and to refugees. It's only been in the past few years, I would say, since the so-called refugee crisis or the migrant crisis in Europe in 2015, that Egypt has started to have talks and conversations and summits with countries from Europe on so-called border externalization and other issues that are prevalent now more than ever. Of course, Egypt is not a passive actor in these conversations. They're not just at the whim of whatever the European Union or other countries want. But I think that they're willing to have these negotiations and these discussions because the concept of refugees and migrants and people becoming more interested in their backgrounds and where they're from and what they're doing has kind of spurred this political movement for Egypt to become more of an actor and more of a player in these discussions with countries from Europe. So I think in the political realm, we see this in the supposed new asylum law that hopefully will be released this year, which no one has seen yet, but we're all very interested to see what it says. But also in 2016, there was the passing of the anti-smuggling and trafficking law after, unfortunately, a boat capsized leaving from Egypt across the Mediterranean and trying to reach Europe, either Greece or Italy. And of course, we can argue that Egyptians were also on this boat, and Egypt doesn't also want their own citizens to perish. But it was mixed. As Maisa said, there are Egyptians who want to go abroad looking for better opportunities in the workforce, but also there are registered refugees who also, feel that because maybe they're having difficulty accessing services, that if they had an opportunity in Europe, it might be better for them. Now we know the numbers of these boats and of these journeys and travels has decreased significantly since the passing of this law, but it hasn't completely, of course, stopped. We can't, close borders completely anywhere. But I think this is also a political issue that arose after the so-called, 2015 crisis in Europe, if we're talking about the political realm. In the economic realm, of course, refugees contribute to the economy. We don't actually have official numbers because most of them work in the informal sector, like most Egyptians. So it's really hard to get official numbers when it comes to the economy and the economic contribution. But we do know that they obviously contribute to the economy by working in the informal sector, by being daily wage earners. So this obviously, I think, is the same anywhere in the world. If you live anywhere, you contribute to the economy by renting a house, by sending your kids to school, by accessing healthcare, by registering a birth. From all of these different things that maybe we take for granted, they're contributing to the economy besides obviously the main reason for working in the informal sector. And if we're talking socially, I think we're seeing a really maybe not a huge increased interest, but definitely an increased interest in refugees and migrants in general. I think we see this as a research center and that we're seeing lots of Egyptians actually apply for the master's degree program, which 5-10 years ago, this was not the case. Most CMRS students were coming from abroad, from overseas, excuse me, but now a lot of our students are either registered refugees in Egypt because we have the scholarship for refugees in Egypt, but we also see an increase among Egyptian students wanting to go into the field, either working at an INGO or working in refugee law. So I think socially, people are becoming aware that these communities exist. And then, not to say that a lot of these refugees work in the restaurant industry, but how many Syrian restaurants have we seen in Cairo where they pop up almost every week and people love them? They love them. They love the Yemeni restaurants in Doi. There's the Sudanese cafes in downtown, right? And people are starting to go to these places to talk to the people. And it might not be, an overnight, change in mind and change in opinion. But I think, this is kind of like soft power in a way. sharing their culture, they're sharing their food, they're playing their local music, they're sending their kids to schools, they're living in the community. And just by living in a community and interacting in the urban setting, I think over time we'll see even, a greater change within the Cairo social of what refugees and migrants really contribute to a country that has always hosted people from abroad, that has always had, these historical connections with Libya, with Sudan, with hosting pilgrims going on the Hajj to Mecca, right? So Egypt is a bridge to the Mediterranean and to Africa and to Asia. So this is nothing new historically. I think it's just how we're viewing it within the the new political realm of talking about refugees and migrants. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Fernando. Now, as we transition to round 4, I wanted to ask, because since I can see that there are no real questions in the chat, I wanted to, before we take on best ways forward and long-term strategies, maybe let's talk about briefly, please, Maisa and Maritza, about what are some of the biggest challenges affected communities of both migrants and refugees are facing now. And in your opinion, what needs to change in order to better address their needs?
You want me to start?
Sure, please. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. So just following up on what Elena mentioned, I think that the real challenge for migrant and refugees in Egypt is that there is no prospect for any future long-term future solution. So as I mentioned, and as Elena mentioned,
you mean a legal one?
Sorry?
You mean a legal one?
Yes, because
Yes.
as we mentioned, that there is no a local integration is not put forward as the official policy, national policy. I don't know if I mentioned or not, but in the MOU, which with the UNHCR, which is still the main and only legal instrument in addition to the 1951 convention. I mean, because there are no local asylum law up till this moment, so the MOU represent the real local instrument. It is clearly the MOU clearly states that the only two solutions for the refugee problem is either repatriation to the country of origin or resettlement to a third country. So local integration in the legal sense of the term is not an option. And this is a real challenge. Having said that, most of the, as Elena mentioned, most of the refugees in Egypt are de facto, what we call de facto integrated. De facto integrated because there is no policy of encampment, and refugees and asylum seekers live in proximity to the local population. So by default, they get in touch with the population, they work in the informal sector. So they are de facto integrated because they do have access to income generating activities, they do have connection with the local population, but not in the legal sense. And of course, the issue is that the degree of de facto integration differ from one community to the other. So we can see that the Syrian community is by far more de facto integrated than other communities. And this come up a lot in our research. And for example, when I did the research with Syrian refugee women, who are the most de facto integrated group, they said that they are settled well in Egypt. They do have access to livelihood opportunities. They have good relationship with the host population, but they don't see any future for their children. And this is because there is no long-term solution. There is no future. So even though they put their children in schools and sometimes in universities, but there is no future. Just one example, refugees who completed their education in Egypt for example, in the medical school, in Egyptian universities, they cannot practice medicine because they are treated as foreigners, as Elena said. So they cannot register in the syndicate and they cannot practice medicine. So I think and that's why also in my research with Syrian women, there was this talk about hopefully their children will move to Europe to find better opportunities, and usually in a very risky manner. So this put them in a critical situation. The other issue or the other challenge, which Elena mentioned, is the implementation of laws. So even though there are some laws that expanded the right of refugees, but when it comes to actual implementation, we don't see that they benefit from the services that have been, even those who have access to schools, they don't really benefit from that. So this is a very serious issue. The challenges faced by civil society, I think there are two main challenges. One is access to funding, and the second is access to the population. And this brings us back to the problem of numbers, because we don't know the real number of migrant and refugees. We only know those who are registered with UNHCR. So a large number of migrant and refugees are not, I mean, the civil society organization are not able to reach all people of concern. Of course, and as mentioned by Elena, the fact that now migration and refugee issues is mainstreamed within the work of different organizations. So it's no longer the case that UNHCR is the only international organization or the only UN agency that serve refugees. So for example, now the UNICEF serve migrant children and refugee children, the UN Women serve migrant women. So it is much better than 10 or 20 years ago. Also local Egyptian organization, when we started our work, when the center first operated in Egypt, no local organization would work with migrant and refugees. Now you see more and more local organization working with migrant and refugees. The government challenge is the fact that it is a developing country, and there is always this discourse that the country is struggling to cater for its own local population and to provide them with adequate services. So it's very difficult to also cater for migrant and refugees. However, again, since we know that the number registered with UNHCR is very insignificant, so 200,000 for 22 million in Cairo or 100 million in all Egypt is not a significant number. So what we're calling for is at least those who are registered with UNHCR to have proper access to services, not only in terms of laws, but in terms of actual implementation, to really reach the services that are given to them by the law. One example, UNHCR card, for example. UNHCR card is not recognized. It's not recognized by Egyptian banks, so they cannot open bank account. It is not recognized by the Ministry of Manpower, so they don't, even if we are able to, even if a sponsor is willing to sponsor a work permit for a refugee, it is not recognized as an identity document. So these are all issues that makes it more difficult for refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt. I think.
Thank you, Maisa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please, Maritza.
Sure. So a couple of things that are going on in the United States, not only in Florida, is affordable housing. And that's definitely a big challenge for refugees, not only owning a house, but also renting, which is very high. So that I'm very sure it's definitely one of the biggest challenges, the issue of homelessness as well, because there is no affordable housing. That is a consequence. People living in their cars, or living in the parks, or camping, or just living in their friends' sofa and staying the nights there. That all of those are accounted for homelessness population. The other thing has to do with the labor market. There are a lot of changes in the labor market in the US right now. Interestingly, there is a lot of openings in restaurants, in grocery stores, in malls, or that kind of working environment. And there is a reason, I don't know why, still why people don't want to continue working in those scenarios, or are they looking for a better quality of life? And that could be something related to COVID and the consequences of being at home and being with their family, and putting priorities as to where you want to go and what you want to do with your life, right, in terms of quality. American integration is always a challenge, specifically for refugees that have low English proficiency, and that could be related to refugees who are Spanish speaking, specifically in Central and South Florida. In Miami, as what Fernando was saying, there is, and I used to live in Miami for several years, there is a community called, Little Havana, and then you have the little Peruvian community, the little Colombian, and so on and so on. So it's sort of like living in your country of origin, not using English at all. And when you're trying to go into school or find another job that is not associated with those subgroups, then it becomes an issue. Something that people don't talk out loud, it's something that is being seen right now as a consequence of COVID, and that also affects the refugee population here in the US. It's mental health support, behavioral health, depression, anxiety, all of those issues that definitely have an effect in the refugee population and in the population in general in the US. And also educational attainment. Right now, and back in my study, most of refugees prefer to look for a job or secure a job opportunity rather than going back to school. And so that could also limits their opportunity to get another job, get a better opportunity, get higher salary, and get all those economic benefits. And that sometimes is associated again with English proficiency, right? So those are like the main challenges that I see in the US and in Central Florida as well regarding refugees.
Thank you very much, Maritza, and thank you, Maisa. I think we have time to maybe try to go ahead and explore one of the questions that Erin is posing, which is what are some of the economic positive impacts of migrants and refugees in Florida? She's asking for at least one specific example. If you may, Fernando or Maritza, please.
Yeah, no, sure. So I have a report from the American Immigrant Council from 2020, looking at specifically that, right? So immigrants in Florida have contributed tens of billions of dollars in taxes. Immigrant-led households in the state paid around $23.2 billion in federal taxes, $8.5 billion in state and local taxes in 2018. Undocumented immigrants in Florida paid an estimated $1.3 billion in federal taxes and $588.3 million in state and local taxes. Even the DACA recipients paid an estimated $76.6 million in state and local taxes out here. More importantly, out here in terms of the entrepreneurs that we have out here, about 33% of all self-employed Florida residents were immigrant business owners. So Elena, were you talking about, the restaurants and all those type of things? We see that here in Florida as well. You can get as authentic as you, and probably with all ethnic groups throughout the world out there in terms of that, but creating jobs. Obviously, we'll have to see what's the impact of COVID, like Maritza was saying, in terms of that. I see the restaurant business, the service industry took a hit, but now it's coming back with a force, at least here in Florida. So what might be some of the opportunities out there? Places like Miami, 57% of business owners was an immigrant, 36% in Orlando, 29% in Tampa Bay, St. Pete, and Clearwater, and 20% in Jacksonville. So, you know, it's a population of entrepreneurs that bring about a lot of economic power out here in terms of that. And basically, as consumers, immigrants added nearly $100 billion to Florida's economy. So these are significant numbers in terms of the state. But, you know, and those are kind of like the positive type of contributions out here. And that's why, you know, and again, I think Elena mentioned something that, you know, is sort of we also act like a gateway to the Caribbean and Latin America. And that brings about some of the issues, I think, for Egypt as well, in terms of being a gateway to other communities as well. And I think that the issue, you know, in terms of the problems, also kind of like the issue, how much is this short term to long term, right? And I think those are, you know, when we're talking about issues of climate migration or, you know, economic turmoil or wars or all those type of things, how much are temporarily and how much are long term? And that, I think, is an issue, you know, that we need to start looking a little bit more deeply as well.
Thank you so much, and as well as conducting these 3D jobs, right? The difficult, the dirty, and the dangerous jobs that the local community, you know, local citizens don't want to do any longer. Yet, usually it's undocumented people that have to perform some of those jobs, and this is a huge impact on the inner workings of society. Thank you very much, Fernando. And now, as we approach our last minutes of the event, I want to thank you very much. You know, for panelists, it has been an amazing exchange of ideas. Also, for all of the participants, it has been evidently an event that needs a second and third and fourth part, because we only scratched some of the main issues. However, we were able to explore in detail some of the most relevant topics for migrants and refugees, both in Florida and Cairo. I now give the floor to Mirvat, and thank you very much for your participation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Carlos. I just want to echo you and your kind words on behalf of UCF Global Perspectives and International Initiatives and AUC Center for Migration and Refugee Study. I would like to thank our panelists most of all, and our moderator for today's discussion, Carlos, and of course all our attendees for attending today's discussion. We hope to see you all in our future events. Until then, please stay safe and well. Thank you all.
Thank you all.